As the Data and Statistics Bill gets ever closer to becoming law, former government statistician Len Cook continues to worry it will have unintended consequences. He joins me now. What's your specific concern about this legislation?
Well, I think the government statistician has long been a very trusted role in New Zealand. And the idea in the legislation that you can clone that role to unspecified other people, they may be chief executives of government departments, they could be anyone, with no oversight, strikes me as being absolutely bizarre. You've got no ability to ensure that those people bring the impartiality, the transparency, the expertise that we expect of a government statistician and Department of Statistics.
But under this proposed law, doesn't the government statistician have the responsibility to make sure those people, if he does delegate some sort of statistical authority, that they do the job properly?
Well, of course, it's like shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. And also, people have a different view of confidentiality and privacy. In the 1996 census, for example, a policeman thought he could use his authority to pretend to be a statistics officer to obtain information from people. His view of confidentiality was very different. He was looking after someone who he thought was a criminal. So the statistics privacy was almost nothing to him. I sent it off to the Police Complaints Authority at the time. Judge Jeffreys said, "Oh, no, it's fine, we'll let the cop off." Now, again, a policeman didn't judge statistical confidentiality as having the same import as in their particular roles.
But don't we have a much greater sense of privacy now than we did then? And with the Privacy Commission around, aren't there some safeguards around that?
Oh, not like anywhere else. I mean, Australia, for example, in April this year introduced a Data Transparency and Sharing Act. The British have had, since 2017, very powerful data sharing legislation. The New Zealand government has got no legislation of the scale and precision that, for example, the Australian Act has. In the Australian Act, for example, it distinguishes between information used for enforcement and surveillance, information for services provision, and information for statistics, and it creates very careful domains. We have got none of that. In New Zealand, it's completely unfettered.
So you would want to see legislation that makes it very clear that statistics collected for statistics by Statistics New Zealand are only used for statistical reasons, not for any other.
Yes, and that includes research, because I think it's also important to recognise that perception will play a big part here. If it looks like these roles are being merged, for example, the government statistician is part of an international network of chief statisticians that are responsible for the official statistics, which means that people can trust trade, international markets function, rating agencies operate, because those statistics are produced by people who are known to be accountable in the law they've got. If you pass on that authority to unspecified others, what will Moody's and pause it? I was around in 92 when we doubled the balance of payments deficit one year and halved it 3 months later. And Ruth Richardson called me up and said, "Len, I'm off to see Standard & Poor's and Moody's in New York next week. What do I tell them about our credit rating? And in fact, it was a very strong reminder that part of the credibility of statistics when you're in deep trouble is in fact the people that produce them. And we're going to go through a pretty rough time in the next few years. Is that the time when our government statistician's role looks a little bit uncertain to people that have come to see it as a distinct individual?
So you think, for instance, the ratings agencies might start to look at the information they're seeing about the New Zealand economy with a bit more scepticism?
Well, part of it is that they should do, because it's part of the role of the government statistician to guarantee that. It's interesting, the IMF, for example, has special data dissemination standards, and New Zealand's about one of the 3 countries in the world that doesn't comply with them. So we have a different risk. We ought to do nothing to create an appearance of distrust in the government statistician. And can I make a fundamental question? Why we don't need to do this. We can do all sorts of things with data sharing and data exchange without this authority being shifted. It's a sort of a totally unnecessary addition to achieving what ministers want to achieve.
Is there a risk too then, given on your criticism, that people will actually start giving information to Statistics New Zealand if they have a suspicion it might be used for other means?
Well, I think that the trouble is that the bill says that data is information and it can be anything. So it actually has widened the range of things that a government statistician is enabled to connect. I think that the issues of what the government statistician does, I can't imagine that being seriously jeopardised. But when other people start saying, I'm applying the Statistics Act, but I'm also the Commissioner of Police or the Commissioner of Inland Revenue, I think that will create a certain amount of distrust amongst more active privacy communities, civil liberties and that.
But won't they only be able to do that, though, with the express approval of the government statistician?
The government statistician is giving them full authority on his role, full legislative powers, including the ability to prosecute. So there is no constraint on that role.
No constraint at all in the...
No, not in the legislation. Clause 17 doesn't put any constraints that are of significance.
But I think Statistics New Zealand, though, have argued there are, controls around it because the government statistician is going to have the responsibility for monitoring it.
And how do you monitor it? How do you know what goes on in organisations? So I mentioned each organisation has a very different view of privacy and confidentiality. In a stats office, it's unambiguously clear we do not release individual information that's for purposes other than research, other than statistics, and for research we release anonymised information that is still individual details. I think other agencies, that I pointed out with the police case, have a different view of privacy and confidentiality.
So will this undermine the independence of the government statistician?
Look, I've been in Europe when I was at a conference in Greece in 2004, which had to finish halfway through because the Greek statistician had just been fired for fiddling Greek statistics for defence equipment. The Argentinians popped their chief statistician out of an airplane in '81. Who knows? I mean, we're not going to be doing those extreme things, but it doesn't take much for a little bit of pressure, a reminder from the person that appoints you, the commissioner, State Service Commissioner, that it would be nice if the head of Social Security was also a government statistician as well. I think most of the pressure you get as a government statistician actually from politicians, and they're from other chief executives of big hitting departments acting on behalf of ministers. I would trust the government statistician completely, but it's a very different environment. I mean, the pressure I had in Britain, for example, is massively different than in New Zealand.
In what way?
Well, for example, Gordon Brown had his golden rules. We were also part of the EU. So, for example, when Britain decommissioned its nuclear power stations, was the decommissioning that was palmed on to private enterprises on or off the government books? And we were the people that decided whether it was on the books. And so that creates a huge tension between ministers that want to manage a golden rule and ensure that government debt is managed in a particular way.
And under this legislation, do you think that political tension here will get bigger? That sort of tension?
I think it creates the possibility of it. Because we operate in a pretty naive environment in New Zealand. We have none of the pressures. The government statistician's job in New Zealand is probably more trusted than in most other countries. It doesn't take much to challenge it. We don't have the same number of people challenging our statistical processes as we do in other countries. And I think that lacking that oversight and lacking, as I mentioned, the prior legislation on data sharing that the Australians have, that the British have, we just create uncertainties.
Len Cook, thank you for your time.
Thank you.